Oh, it's been known as Horse Creek Valley for as long as anyone can remember. The valley brims with tales of those who came and built empires, and those who passed through leaving only their footprints. You see, from the very beginning, everyone left a mark in this valley, from people whose names were known to millions to those whose names have long since been forgotten. Horse Creek has flowed in and out of each of their lives, weaving together a tale that's worth the telling. What today is called the Fall Line is the remnant of a 300-million-year-old coastline. Once, ocean waves crested over what would become Aiken County, South Carolina, and lapped upon the shores of what would become Horse Creek Valley. Each new tribe and colony who happened upon this area discovered the resources of this geographic wonder.
You know, if you lived right on that fall line there, in other words, where you could no longer, in historic times, take a boat up the river because of the rocks, and of course that would mean Indians could get across the river pretty easily in times of low water. That made a great congregating place, but also from a locational standpoint, it is sort of situated at a place where 2, 3, maybe 4 major environments are all within a day's walk. And once you leave that little magic intersection of all those environments or micro-environments, then you lose some diversity, either going up into the Piedmont or going down into the coastal plain.
The evidence of this environmental nexus can be traced to the Clovis people some 13,000 years ago. They could reach a rich deposit of chert, the perfect material for making tools and weapons, in just a day's walk downriver from their valley.
Now, in the area of what we know as Langley Pond today, of course, which is a modern creation by our society, before it was dammed up, it was a good free-flowing stream and would have been quite attractive to early peoples, early hunters and gatherers. We know this because diagnostic stone spears and axes and scrapers and pottery and so forth have been found actually in abundance in the bottom of Langley Pond as they would drain it and so forth. In fact, one good Clovis point has come from Langley Pond, and we've recorded it in the South Carolina Paleo-Indian Point database. Location, 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 even in prehistory.
In the centuries before Europeans arrived in the Southeast, there were Native American communities across the landscape. There were some places like the Savannah River Valley that was abandoned. There were other places like that across the Southeast where people had lived and then moved away for reasons we don't understand. But pretty much there were people everywhere.
Those Native Americans were about to meet a new breed of man, one with unfamiliar ambitions and an intense desire to call this land home. When the European colonists anchored their ships on the coast of South Carolina, they intended to stay.
Well, Charleston was settled in 1670, and right away the colonists at Charleston tried to establish friendly relations with all the Indians in the surrounding area because they were dependent on those people for food, plus they didn't want to be attacked and driven out by local Indian populations, the numbers of which they didn't really know.
In 1674, an early Carolina colonist named Dr. Henry Woodward was invited by the Westo Indians to visit their village near Horse Creek Valley. Woodward wrote, "The next day I viewed the town, which was built in a confused manner, consisting of many long houses, whose sides and tops were artificially done with bark. Upon the tops of most, and fastened to the ends of long poles, hang the locks of hair of Indians they have slain."
The Indians on the South Carolina coast and surrounding regions were pretty much terrified by the Westo, who had guns and were able to raid pretty much without restraint in all directions. They led to the depopulation of all of interior Georgia pretty much. They attacked the South Carolina coastal tribes, and among those coastal tribes, they were said to be afraid of the Westo to the point that they feared the very footsteps of the approaching Westo. Part of that was because they thought that the Westo were cannibals. The Westo probably were not cannibals, but what happened with the Westo that was different from other Indian societies, if somebody raided your town and took captives, they weren't taken far away, they had the possibility of escaping and returning, but people who were captured and taken away by the Westo never came back because they were sold as slaves to Virginia or farther north into New England, or put on ships and shipped to the West Indies, so that people, once they were captured, were gone for good, and the only explanation that Carolina Indians had for that was the Westo must have consumed them.
Seen as an impediment to the expanding trade enterprise from Charleston, the Westo were doomed. Armed with firepower provided by the Carolina colony, the Shawnee or Savannah Indians overthrew the Westo in 1680. Their reward? To take over the trade with Charleston. Expansion into the fertile interior was now anchored by Fort Moore, located just across the Savannah River from present-day Augusta.
Actually, South Carolina was a great place to go because the land was still good, even if you lived in the interior and couldn't plant rice like the rich people on the coast. Not only did they like the fact that they could become more prosperous by settling this relatively cheap, easy, free land, but they liked the fact that it was far from Charleston's government. Settlers were always aware that to the west of them were the Native Americans. And to the east of the people here were slaves, and an uprising on either side would pin the people in Horse Creek Valley in. So it was reassuring to have a British presence there. You couldn't depend on the British to solve all your problems for you, but at least it helped. But on the other hand, as tensions rose, the very thing that attracted people in the Scots-Irish communities here, that they didn't have to deal with government, began to become a mixed blessing because the problems of the world were coming for them too.
Led by their chief, Squirrel King, a band of Chickasaw from an area in Mississippi answered the entreaties of the settlers. They became the buffer between the other hostile tribes like the Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee. The Chickasaw were recognized as the guardians of the valley.
Well, the Chickasaw, after they settled in the Savannah River Valley, got caught up in the same deerskin trade and Indian slave trade that their predecessors had been involved in, though they arrived right at the end of both of those. So there were fewer and fewer Indian slaves being taken because of the decimation of the Indian population in the nearby regions, and also because deerskins were falling out of favor in clothing styles in Europe.
While Fort Moore offered the Native Americans a decent market for their skins and a good trade with the colonists, the protection of the fort enticed even more settlers from Europe to help themselves to Native American territory. The Chickasaw watched as the new colonists took up residence on their land.
And the British had helped provoke the American Revolution in part by drawing a line in the sand, not too far west from here, and saying, colonists, settlers, you can't go any farther west because that's Native American territory, and we're going to protect it for the Native Americans. And that infuriated a lot of colonists and helped provoke the war. But from Native Americans, that made the British a better bet, and a lot of the Native American groups in this area did ally with the British.
The British had a solution. They granted the Chickasaw a 21,000-acre reserve along Horse Creek in 1739.
But even that didn't give them any protection because there was nobody really to enforce the boundaries. There were people moving in right away. Actually, there were probably already settlers living on that land when it was granted to the Chickasaw, and there was no way for the Chickasaw to remove them.
About the time of the Chickasaw land grant, an Irishman immigrated to the valley. George Golphin was well known for mixing his trading skills with his fascination for the native peoples. he became a vital link among the government officials in Charleston, the settlers, and the Indians.
A white trader with the Indians that doesn't treat them as though they're children, or that they're ignorant, or that they're just savages, but treats them as human beings, as equals for the most part, and to the point where he fits in with them, and he's not there to get them drunk and steal things from them or anything else. He treats them with respect.
Golphin married the daughter of a Creek chief, and they had several children he named as beneficiaries in his will.
That's so unusual, it's so unique, it's so different, and yet he does these things.
Although Golphin's sympathies were squarely with the Patriots, he still maintained his dealings with the British.
When the British seize his post and they control it, that Light Horse Harry Lee actually raids the trading post and captures, the supplies from the British. And so it's nothing against George Golphin. It's just that his site is actually involved in the Revolutionary War, and that the father of Robert E. Lee is the one who does the raid.
With the winding down of the French war against the Chickasaw in Mississippi, the Chickasaw in the valley began to return to their homelands. Now the settlers faced a decision about their future.
Well, I think we always have this idea that loyalists were people who ideologically supported the crown, and there were some of those, but in the backcountry, most people weren't driven by ideology. And a lot of people tried to avoid the question, who am I for as long as possible. That was a way to lose your land. That was a way to get involved in problems that a lot of ordinary people didn't want to worry about. But when the war came to their doorstep, when the first militia stole their cow, when the battle came to them, when a militia told them that if they didn't cooperate, they were going to have their crops and their houses burned down, then people had to choose a side, and staying out of it wasn't possible. But they didn't necessarily choose for ideological reasons. Communities tended to stick together, so if the local planter decided to be a loyalist and he was a community leader, then those people probably followed him. And if he decided to be a patriot, they followed him into the patriot cause. In many cases, they saw themselves as also protecting their own communities.
Just as the colonists were adjusting to their newfound independence, more people pushed their way into Horse Creek Valley. Also came the planters, who gobbled up large expanses of land on which to raise cotton.
It is self-evident that most of the slaves that were in South Carolina in particular were used in the field. This is a state that had found most of its income, if you will, was with landholders who had large plantations who would then have slaves to do all the agricultural work.
People who were not considered free steadily built their communities right alongside those who enslaved them. They tried as best they could to create a place for themselves within a system that regarded them only as property.
It's my understanding, I guess, that the slaves, when they were praising God, made such a loud noise and all until Lamar moved them down from their place down by the branch. I guess initially it was just like a wooded area or something like that. That's where they would meet and have their church. And maybe the storm did come up or something, but they named it Storm Branch. Actually, they say it was organized July the 9th, 1772. But the church was not built at that time. They were still out, I guess, under the harbor. Later on, somebody who worked at the pottery designed the blueprint for the church.
The same enthusiasm and ambition that had accompanied settlers to South Carolina's backcountry now became more visible in the landscape. In 1793, Eli Whitney perfected his cotton gin. just a little more than 100 miles down the Savannah River from Horse Creek Valley. His gin allowed more cotton to be processed in less time. For planters who held land in the valley, like the Lamars and the Hammonds, this innovation meant that great wealth was just about to arrive. It was the big city across the river, the city that seemed to get all the attention and all the trade, until one enterprising immigrant named Henry Schultz arrived from Hamburg, Germany.
In Augusta, Georgia in 1806, the first thing an immigrant does is push a pole boat up and down the Savannah River. And what these pole boats were doing was picking up local produce, carrying it down to Savannah, then getting manufactured items such as cigars, iron tools, cloth, paper, toting it back up the river to Augusta in a constant shuttle back and forth. As he went down the river, he saw these forests of cypress trees. And he looked at those and said, my God, they don't have anything like that in Europe. And he'd heard that these trees were imperishable. They literally last forever. And he thought, why can't we use this majestic timber to build a bridge, which is what Augusta really needs right now to make that city fly.
Schultz was possessed by an idea that would serve to drive him for the rest of his life: the joining of the valley in South Carolina to the commercial seaports in Savannah and Charleston.
At the time, it was just a howling wilderness. There was nothing over there. But there were farmers on the other side. And the farmers were desperate to bring their cotton and their produce over to Augusta so they could put onto a steamboat, carried down the river to Savannah, and sold for cash money. They must have talked to a ton of people in order to work up the many tens of thousands of dollars that it took to do the job. And in a matter of a year, the bridge was done and it was collecting tolls.
Schultz was proud of his accomplishment. So proud, in fact, that he could see even more opportunities on the horizon for himself and his magnificent bridge.
Schultz said, "My bridge is better than gold. It's a solid item that's not going anywhere. It returns its value every 5 years. Gold doesn't remotely do that. So this is better, and I'm going to found a bank on the strongest of all possible assets, my bridge." It just happened that his bridge was involved in a mortgage, and the mortgage was not paid, and the bank that held that mortgage was willing to move heaven and earth to get their hands on that bridge, and they did so. And guess who is absolutely enraged by not having his beautiful bridge any longer? Henry Schultz. And who promised revenge for injuries? Henry Schultz. So he got a job on the riverfront. He was in charge of the Port Authority, and he could watch the traffic coming across his bridge. He was a very intelligent, very questing sort of man who turned everything over in his mind, looking for a way to get what he wanted. And I'm sure he thought that, wouldn't it be great if wagons were crossing the river in the other direction, carrying cotton to my town, instead of coming from South Carolina to carry cotton to Augusta.
So began the creation of a town that would see both the best of times and the worst of times. Schultz named his sweet revenge Hamburg. Once again, his dream of owning a successful upriver trading center was about to become a reality.
Horatio Allen pointed out that the power of a horse was known. It was set. A horse 100 years from now wouldn't be able to pull any more than a horse does today. But steam engines were a completely different matter. He said with perfect accuracy that nobody had any idea how far those would go in the coming years.
Charleston, once the epicenter for commerce on the East Coast, had become a third-rate port. The directors of the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company were determined to reclaim their city's former position of power. In 1830, work began on the first large-scale steam railroad in the world. Also called the Charleston to Hamburg Railroad, its creation mirrored Henry Schultz's ambitions to stop South Carolina cotton from being transported down the river to Savannah, Georgia. In October of 1830, the best friend of Charleston was delivered. But, as Horatio Allen had said, steam engines were a completely different matter.
An engine that's powered up and under steam needs to have somebody watching it at all times to make sure nothing happens. And they learned that the hard way when one day in 1831, long before the railroad had even been finished to Hamburg, the best friend blew up.
From the rubble of the best friend rose the Phoenix, ready to run between Charleston and Hamburg. After 2 years of construction, they drove the last spike in 136 miles of track. From 1833 to 1842, it was the longest railroad in the world. At long last, the backcountry fields were directly linked to the ports of Charleston.
In the 1850s, railroads in South Carolina exploded, and so now a farmer could carry his cotton 10 miles, drop it off of a depot, and that's when Hamburg really began to suffer. And finally, by the time of the Civil War, it was a ghost town.
And Henry Schultz, who had made and lost several fortunes, died penniless in 1851. In his final act of revenge, he demanded that he be buried upright on the hill above Hamburg, with his backside facing Augusta. The very earth of the valley is singular and unique. Its place in world history is nothing short of extraordinary.
Below the fall line, to the southeast, those crystalline rocks are covered by much younger sedimentary rocks, sands, silts, clays, and limestones. They are wind-blown remnants of an old shoreline when the ocean was here and Horse Creek Valley would have been beachfront property.
Well, one of the best-known archaeological sites in the whole eastern United States is Stallings Island, which is just above Augusta, North Augusta, in the Savannah River on an island. What makes it important in the prehistory of this part of the world is the pottery that was being made there is called fiber-tempered pottery, or Stallings pottery. But the pottery that these people were making has produced the oldest dates for pottery in all of North America, around 4,500 years ago.
The Stallings people roamed Horse Creek Valley as well, where shards of their pottery are often found.
I find it fascinating that the geologic resources of this area have been studied for more than 150 years by some very famous people.
Dispatched by Governor Hammond in 1844, Michael Toomey, the state's first official geologist, mapped Horse Creek Valley.
He wrote, "The Aiken area affords one of the most remarkable exposures of clay in the United States."
The areas where all the Edgefield potteries were located, there's some 25 or so of them, were on Horse Creek in the upper part of Horse Creek, where you have a different type of clay start to appear, and that's the clay that's needed to produce stoneware. These materials were found in the banks along Horse Creek. Back in the days of the Edgefield potteries, they had no way to remove overburden, so they typically set potteries up around creeks where the water had done the job for them and had eroded and washed away, and they could start digging into the banks. It was easier to get to.
Perhaps only once in a millennium does a person emerge with talents so rare as to never be forgotten. The enslaved man, known only as Dave for most of his life, was a potter of exceptional skill.
Dave was born about 1801. By the time he was 20, he was living in a small community called Pottersville, which was right outside Edgefield. At Pottersville, Dave learned not only how to turn pots, but also how to read and write. This was a risky thing for a slave to do, because in South Carolina, slave owners understood that even the smallest education could allow a slave to begin to ask questions and become less a slave and more a danger to the slavery system. He began to inscribe poems and dates and the name of his owner on the pots that he was making. He even went so far as to inscribe his own original poems on his pots. And somehow Dave, by daring to present his intelligence to the world, was able to get away with it. By hiding nothing, he was able to do anything.
Today, Dave's massive and fantastic jars belong to the permanent collections of prestigious museums, including the Smithsonian.